5 men walked into the Colorado wilderness in February of 1874, and only one walked out. That man was Alfred Greiner Packer, a self-described guide and prospector who emerged from the San Juan Mountains in April of that same year, alone, well-fed, and carrying money that did not belong to him. The question that haunted Colorado for the next decade, and that still haunts forensic historians today, is not simply what happened in those mountains. It is how a man convicted of killing and eating his companions managed to walk free, and what that freedom revealed about the raw, unfinished machinery of American frontier justice. To understand what Alfred Packer did and what Colorado chose to do about it, you have to understand where the frontier stood in the winter of 1874. The American West was in the middle of one of the most chaotic migrations in human history. The Homestead Act of 1862 had thrown open millions of acres to settlers who had no real idea what they were getting into. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed just 5 years earlier in 1869, had stitched the continent together in iron and steam, but it had also created an illusion, the illusion that the West was tamed, that its distances were manageable, that its winters were survivable by ordinary men with ordinary preparation. That illusion killed people constantly. It killed them in blizzards, in river crossings, in ambushes, in mining accidents, and sometimes, in the most extreme cases, it killed them in ways that the people back east simply could not bring themselves to believe. Alfred Packer was born in 1842 in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, the son of a working-class family with no particular distinction. He served briefly in the Union Army during the Civil War, was discharged due to epilepsy, the records confirm this, and spent the years after the war drifting westward through the same gravitational pull that drew hundreds of thousands of restless men toward the promise of mineral wealth. Gold had already transformed California. Silver was reshaping Nevada. And now, in the early 1870s, rumors of rich placer deposits in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado were drawing prospectors into one of the most inhospitable mountain ranges on the continent. Packer joined a party of 21 men in Provo, Utah, in November of 1873. They were heading for the San Juans. They had almost no idea what that meant. The party was led loosely by a man named Israel Swan, one of the older and more experienced members of the group. Packer claimed to know the terrain. He presented himself as a guide, someone who could navigate the mountain passes and lead the group safely to the mining camps near Gunnison. This claim, it would later become clear, was almost entirely fabricated. Packer had spent time in Colorado before, but his knowledge of the specific routes through the San Juan Mountains in winter was essentially non-existent. The men trusted him anyway, because trust was a commodity in short supply on the frontier, and you extended it to whoever seemed most confident. This is one of the recurring tragedies of westward expansion. The confidence of the incompetent was often indistinguishable from the confidence of the expert, and by the time you figured out the difference, you were already deep in the mountains with the snow closing in behind you. And if you find yourself gripped by stories like this, the ones that fall through the cracks of official history, the ones where the law fails, where the wilderness wins, and where the truth takes decades to surface, then this channel is exactly where you belong. We dig into the documented record of the American frontier, and we don't stop until we find what really happened. Subscribe and you'll never miss one of these stories. In late January of 1874, the party reached the camp of Chief R.A., the leader of the Uncompahgre Ute, near present-day Montrose, Colorado. This is a detail that matters enormously because R.A., one of the most diplomatically sophisticated native leaders of the 19th century, looked at the weather, looked at the mountains, and told the group in the clearest possible terms not to proceed. The passes were buried. The snow was deep and unpredictable. The route Packer claimed to know was a death trap in February. R.A. had spent his entire life in these mountains. He knew them the way a surgeon knows the human body, intimately, precisely, with a clear understanding of what could kill you and what could not. The group listened to him, rested at his camp, and then, because gold has a way of overwhelming common sense, 6 of the men decided to push on anyway. Alfred Packer was one of them. The others were Shannon Wilson Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, George Noon, and Israel Swan. 6 men entered the mountains. What happened next is one of the most disputed, disturbing, and forensically fascinating episodes in the history of the American West. Packer would tell several versions of the story over the course of his life, and the versions contradicted each other in significant ways. In his first account, given to the agent at the Los Pinos Indian Agency in April of 1874, he claimed that the group had become lost, that they had run out of food, and that his companions had died one by one of starvation and exposure, after which he had been forced to eat their flesh to survive. This is the classic survival cannibalism narrative, the one that had precedent in frontier and maritime history. The Donner Party, just 27 years earlier, had established that desperate men and women could resort to consuming the dead without being considered murderers. If Packer's story had been consistent, if the physical evidence had supported it, the case might have ended there. But the physical evidence did not support it, not even close. When Packer arrived at the Los Pinos agency, the agent, Charles Adams, noticed several things immediately. Packer was not emaciated. He was not frostbitten in the way you would expect from months in a mountain winter. He had money, significant amounts of it, that he could not adequately explain. He was, by multiple accounts, in reasonably good physical condition. The men at the agency who had known the missing prospectors began to grow suspicious. Packer was detained, questioned, and eventually released, only to be detained again when a more damning piece of evidence surfaced in August of 1874. A Harper's Weekly illustrator named John A. Randolph was traveling through the area when he stumbled upon the remains of 5 men near the shores of what is now called Lake San Cristobal, along the Lake Fork of the Gunnison River. The bodies were not scattered in the way you would expect from men who had died separately of starvation and exposure. They were grouped together, and the wounds on the bodies were not consistent with natural death. Here's the detail that changes everything. The state of the remains and the subsequent forensic analysis conducted over a century later in 1989 by Dr. James Starrs of George Washington University indicated that at least some of the men had been killed by blunt force trauma to the skull. Starrs' team, working with the exhumed remains, found evidence of hatchet wounds on the bones, wounds that were consistent with attack rather than with the butchering of men who had already died. The forensic record suggested that these were not men who had starved to death and been consumed out of desperation, at least some of them. The evidence was strongest for Israel Swan had been killed. The distinction between eating the dead and killing the living is, legally and morally, the distance between survival and murder. Packer was arrested in Fort Fetterman, Wyoming in March of 1883. Nearly 9 years after the killings, he had been living under an assumed name, John Schwartze, in Cheyenne. The man who recognized him was a former member of the original Utah Party, a man named Frenchy Cabazon, who spotted him in a saloon and reported him to authorities. 9 years. The frontier was large enough and the mechanisms of law enforcement sparse enough that a man could disappear into it for nearly a decade. This was not unusual. The West in the 1870s and early 1880s was a jurisdictional nightmare, a patchwork of territorial governments, federal agencies, military authority, and outright lawlessness, where the question of who had the right to arrest, try, and punish a man depended enormously on where you were standing when you asked it. Packer was tried in Lake City, Colorado, in April of 1883. The trial was a spectacle. Lake City was a small mining community, and the courthouse was packed. The prosecution argued murder. Packer maintained that he had killed only one man, Shannon Bell, in self-defense after Bell had gone mad with hunger and killed the others. This version of events, his third or fourth depending on how you count, was more dramatically coherent than his earlier accounts, but it still did not fully explain the physical evidence. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on 5 counts of murder. The judge, Melville Jerry, sentenced Packer to hang 5 times, once for each victim, in a sentence that was theatrical even by the standards of frontier justice. And then something extraordinary happened. The sentence was never carried out. Packer's lawyers appealed, and in 1885, the Colorado Supreme Court overturned the conviction on a technical legal ground that was, in its own way, a perfect encapsulation of the frontier's uneasy relationship with the law. The murders had been committed in 1874. When Colorado was still a territory, Packer had been tried under a state law passed after Colorado achieved statehood in 1876. The court ruled that he could not be tried under a law that did not exist at the time of the crime. This is not an obscure legal technicality. It is a foundational principle of criminal law, the prohibition on ex post facto prosecution. But the effect was jarring. A man who had almost certainly killed 5 people walked out of a death sentence because the state that wanted to execute him had not yet existed when he committed the crime. He was retried in 1886, this time on 5 counts of manslaughter under the territorial law that had been in effect in 1874. He was convicted again and sentenced to 40 years in prison, 8 years for each count, to be served consecutively. He entered the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City and became, over the following years, a model prisoner. He tended a garden. He was reportedly kind to other inmates. He was, by the accounts of the guards and administrators who knew him, a quiet, unremarkable man who showed no outward signs of the violence attributed to him. This is one of the most unsettling patterns in the history of violent crime: the ordinariness of the perpetrator in captivity, the complete absence of the monster that the crime seemed to require. In 1901, after serving 15 years of his 40-year sentence, Alfred Packer was paroled. The parole was granted largely through the efforts of Polly Pry, a Denver journalist, one of the first prominent female journalists in Colorado history, who had become convinced that Packer was either innocent or had suffered enough. Pry's campaign on Packer's behalf is a remarkable episode in its own right. She wrote a series of articles in the Denver Post arguing for his release, gathered signatures, and lobbied the governor directly. Her efforts succeeded. Packer walked out of prison at the age of 59, settled in Littleton, Colorado, and lived out the remaining years of his life in relative quiet, working as a ranch hand and reportedly becoming a vegetarian, a detail that is almost certainly apocryphal, but has proven too irresistible for chroniclers to leave out. He died in April of 1907, 33 years after the killings in the San Juan Mountains. He maintained until the end that he had killed only in self-defense. Nobody who knew the full record entirely believed him. Now step back for a moment and consider what this case reveals about the frontier as a system. The American West in the 1870s was not simply a place of adventure and opportunity. It was a place where the ordinary mechanisms of accountability were perpetually overwhelmed by the scale of the migration, the inadequacy of the infrastructure, and the speed at which events outpaced the capacity of institutions to respond to them. Between 1860 and 1880, the population of Colorado grew from roughly 34,000 to over 194,000 people. That is nearly a 6-fold increase in 20 years, driven almost entirely by mining booms and land speculation. The courts, the jails, the roads, the telegraph lines, none of it kept pace. In that environment, a man like Packer could disappear for 9 years, not because he was especially clever, but because the system was not built to find him. The San Juan Mountains themselves were central to the broader story of Colorado's development in ways that go beyond the Packer case. The Bruneau Agreement of 1873, signed just months before Packer's party entered the mountains, had extinguished Ute title to the San Juan region, opening it to mining exploration. Chief R.A. himself had signed that agreement under pressure as part of a broader pattern of treaty negotiation that steadily reduced Ute landholdings throughout the 1870s. The same mountains that R.A. warned Packer not to enter were mountains that R.A.'s people had just been legally compelled to surrender. There is a bitter irony in that geography. The man who tried to save the prospectors from the mountains had just been forced to give those mountains away. The Ute presence in southwestern Colorado would continue to be eroded throughout the decade. The Meeker Massacre of 1879, in which a group of Ute warriors killed Indian agent Nathan Meeker and several employees at the White River Agency, triggered a military response that resulted in the forced removal of most of the Ute population from Colorado entirely by 1881. R.A. died in 1880 before the removal was completed, and it is difficult not to read his death as a kind of mercy. He did not live to see the final dispossession of the people he had spent his life trying to protect through diplomacy. The frontier consumed its diplomats as surely as it consumed its prospectors. What Packer's case illustrates in its specific and gruesome way is the degree to which the frontier's promise of reinvention was simultaneously its greatest lure and its deepest danger. Men came west to become something new, to shed their eastern identities, to claim land and wealth and status that would have been inaccessible to them at home. Packer himself was a perfect specimen of this type, a working-class man from Pennsylvania with no particular skills, presenting himself as a guide, claiming an expertise he did not possess, leading men into a wilderness he did not understand. The frontier rewarded this kind of audacity sometimes. It punished it catastrophically at others. The difference was often just weather. The forensic reinvestigation of the case in 1989 added a layer of scientific clarity that the original trials could not have provided. Dr. James Starr's team exhumed the remains from their burial site near Lake City and subjected them to analysis using techniques unavailable in the 19th century. The findings were significant. The bone evidence suggested that at least one of the victims, likely Israel Swan, the oldest member of the group, had been killed by repeated blows to the head with a hatchet-like instrument. The cuts on the bones were consistent with butchering after death, but the trauma to the skull was consistent with homicide before death. The forensic picture that emerged was one of a man who had killed, not merely survived. Whether all 5 deaths were homicides or whether some were truly the result of exposure and starvation remains, as the forensic team itself acknowledged, an open question. The evidence was a century old. The mountain winter of 1874 had done its own work on the bodies before anyone found them. What is not an open question is the legal and institutional story. Packer was convicted twice. He served 15 years, he was released. He lived another 6 years as a free man. The system that processed him was not corrupt in the conventional sense. The judges applied the law as they understood it. The lawyers made their arguments. The juries deliberated. But the system was structurally incapable of delivering justice in the way that the crime seemed to demand, because the crime had occurred in a place and at a time when the structures of justice were still being assembled. The territorial to statehood transition that invalidated Packer's first conviction was not a loophole that his lawyers invented. It was a genuine constitutional problem that reflected the improvised provisional nature of governance on the frontier. Law in the American West in the 1870s was not a finished edifice. It was scaffolding. This is the thing about frontier history that gets lost when the story is reduced to folklore. The Packer case has become a kind of dark comedy in Colorado popular culture. There is a cafeteria at the University of Colorado named after him. There is a musical. There are T-shirts. The humor is understandable. The story is so extreme, so gothic, so improbable, that laughter is one reasonable response to it. But behind the dark comedy is a genuine historical tragedy. 5 men who trusted a guide who did not know the way, who entered mountains they were warned not to enter, who died in circumstances that the law could never fully account for, and whose killer, if Packer was the killer, and the forensic evidence suggests he was, served 15 years and died in his bed. The victims were Israel Swan, 60 years old, from Iowa. Shannon Wilson Bell, from somewhere in the Midwest, records incomplete. James Humphrey, Frank Miller, and George Noon. Noon was just 18 years old, 18. He had barely lived long enough to want what the mountains were supposed to offer. The migration routes that brought these men to the San Juans were the same routes that were transforming the entire interior West in the 1870s. The Saguache-San Juan Road, the toll roads built by Otto Mears, the so-called pathfinder of the San Juans, the wagon tracks that connected the mining camps to the supply towns. All of it was being improvised in real time, carved out of terrain that had never been designed for wagon wheels or human feet in winter. Mears himself would go on to build over 450 miles of road and several railroad lines through the San Juans, eventually making the region accessible in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1874. But in February of that year, the infrastructure simply did not exist. The men who entered those mountains did so on foot, through snow that could reach 15 feet in the passes, in temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero at night, with provisions that were almost certainly inadequate from the start. The long-term social consequences of the Packer case are harder to measure than the legal ones, but they are real. The case became part of the mythology of Colorado's territorial period, a story told and retold in ways that shaped how the state understood its own origins. It contributed to the broader cultural narrative of the frontier as a place of extremity, where the ordinary rules of civilization did not apply, and where survival demanded choices that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. This narrative was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. The frontier was also a place of community, of institution building, of genuine social experiment. The same years that produced Alfred Packer also produced the Colorado Constitution, the establishment of public schools, the beginnings of water law that would eventually govern the entire American West. The extremity and the construction were happening simultaneously in the same place, among the same people. What endures about the Packer case, beyond the horror and the dark humor, is what it reveals about the relationship between individual human failure and systemic inadequacy. Packer failed as a guide, possibly as a human being, certainly as a man who could be trusted with the lives of others. But the system also failed to try him promptly, to hold him accountable fully, to deliver a verdict that the law could sustain. The mountains failed the men who entered them unprepared. The promise of the West failed the men who believed in it too completely. In the end, 5 men died in the snow, and the man most likely responsible for their deaths outlived them by 33 years, gardening in a prison yard and then keeping to himself in Littleton, Colorado, while the state that could not quite figure out what to do with him grew up around him. The frontier in this sense was never really about gold or land or freedom. It was about the collision between human ambition and human limitation played out at scale in a landscape that had no patience for the gap between the two. Alfred Packer walked into that gap and 5 men fell through it. Colorado looked at what remained, applied the best law it had, and let him go. And that, more than any single verdict or any single crime, is the story of the American West, a place that was built faster than it could be governed, settled faster than it could be understood, and mythologized so thoroughly that the truth of what happened there has been taking the rest of us a very long time to excavate.